Okay, now we're on to day 2, part 3 of psychedelics. So in this little segment, I'm going to focus on glutamatergic dissociatives and anesthetics. So these are drugs that will make you feel essentially out of your body, maybe floating out of your body, that you lose even the sense of having a body. If taken in enough doses. If taken in a very high dose, you just lose consciousness entirely. They're a very powerful and effective general anesthetic, used and still used in some cases for surgeries. But these are a different class of psychedelic, very different from the classes we've discussed so far. So here, let me just review the classes we've talked about so far. We've looked initially a couple days ago at the anticholinergic and serotonergic-like. We just finished the catecholamine-like with MDMA and mescaline. And now we're going to the glutamatergic NMDA receptor blockers. So it's not like they look like glutamate or glutamatergic receptors. What these drugs do is they actually block that receptor. Whereas in some of the cases like the serotonin-like, you're actually stimulating serotonin receptors. In this case, we're actually blocking the NMDA receptor with these drugs. All right, and the two that we'll focus on today are phencyclidine, or PCP, angel dust, and ketamine, or the commercial name is Ketalar, or Special K is what you might hear the street name for the drug. All right, ketamine, it's weird. And I'm saying it's weird relative to the other psychedelics is that it is operating on very different systems, on this glutamate system. So at least to some degree, all the other ones we talked about probably activate the serotonergic system in some way. But we don't have a clear route by which ketamine might activate the serotonergic system yet. All right, so we'll talk about it in detail, and especially the glutamate system in detail in some moments. All right. So first of all, how do these drugs differ from some of the psychological effects from the drugs we've discussed so far? One, as I suggested earlier, they make you feel more out of your body, either that you don't have your body or that your body feels incredibly distorted. You might be floating above it, or it just feels weird, long. You kind of feel like you have this haze. You're not really in control of your body anymore. There are many different ways, and of course, each person experiences it a little differently, and even the same person taking the drug twice can experience it a bit differently. But in general, it has this effect on your somatosense, your sense of your body. And also, relative to the other drugs we've talked about, it's more psychotomimetic in the sense that it creates a state in people where they're much more similar to somebody who has classic psychosis or is in, let's say, the positive phase of a schizophrenic breakdown. And so it's actually used in some ways in animal models to study the brain mechanisms involved in schizophrenia because it induces so many of the same behaviors and activates similar neural systems that you see in schizophrenia. So it's, again, more psychotomimetic at moderate doses. And when taking at very high doses, unlike the other psychedelics we've talked about, lead to general complete loss of consciousness. So general anesthesia, and both PCP and ketamine are relatively safe anesthetics. You can take them in very high doses. You're completely knocked out. They can take out your kidney and you won't feel a thing. And so a very, very great thing that was invented. They're still used today in veterinary hospitals and clinics for animals because they're safe. And once in a while, they're used in humans if you don't have access, for example, to a respirator because they don't have some of the respiratory negative side effects that many general anesthetics have. And so they can be used more safely, let's say, on the field If you're out in the field, out in the lawn, I mean, you're in the military or something like that, and you're out in the field and you don't have access to all the medical equipment and the respirator, then ketamine is probably the best option because you won't have to worry about the person stopping breathing because of the anesthetic. So a very good drug, important every day for medical uses. That's why it has never been made, ketamine at least, has never been made Schedule 1. It's Schedule 3. So very useful medically, clinically, and for research purposes. All right. Ketamine and PCP, again, act on the glutamatergic system and specifically block these specific NMDA channels and channels/receptors. There are specific voltage-gated receptors that are sensitive to both glutamate and depolarization of the cell membrane. They act also, I mean, it should be noted here, although we won't talk about it so much, ketamine especially acts on many different receptor systems. It acts on the opioid receptor system, somewhat on dopamine receptors too. Opioid is actually pretty strong, but it doesn't seem to have the addictive component that many opioid drugs have. But the principal site of action at least the most popular one to talk about, maybe I should say that until we learn more, is its ability to block the NMDA receptor. Okay, just a very short history. It was ketamine and PCP were developed in the 50s and 60s. PCP was first, so developed in the 50s. And it did work as a general anesthetic, and that's why it was developed. But then PCP kind of makes people a little crazy, sometimes a little violent. Not a great thing when you're coming out of anesthesia to get crazy and violent. So they wanted a drug that didn't make you as crazy and violent. And so ketamine was developed in just a little while later, and it actually didn't make people crazy and violent when they came out of it after the anesthetic started to wear off. And so that's why it's used in the clinic, and PCP is an outlawed drug. All right. Let me see here. Okay, surgical, safer, okay. Okay, so mental effects. I already mentioned this, so I won't go into it too much more, but here's just a review of one of the plots I showed a couple lectures ago on comparing psilocybin on the left and ketamine on the right, and the constellation of feelings and impressions and hallucinations that people have when they're taking these drugs. And so you can see the constellation of these feelings, perceptions that they have differs quite notably between the two, where you have more elementary visual hallucinations in the classic serotonergic psychedelics and more of this feeling being out of your body in ketamine and PCP. You still get some vivid imagery where you might be seeing something, but it feels more enhanced or distorted, but you're not getting kind of these kind of out of nowhere crazy sights and sounds and colors that aren't there in the real world. So that's one thing that one way ketamine differs from the perceptual component of it. Also not mentioned here is it also disrupts memory more than the classic hallucinogens, why we'll spend a number of slides on that in a moment. All right, so beyond being dissociative, making you feel out of your body, what does ketamine feel like? Let's see, you get, here's some other things that you get. You do get these hallucinations where you get this kind of accentuation of sensory stimuli, distortion of incoming sensory stimuli. You get some delusions. This is where the psychotomimetic condition might come in there. You get abnormal movements, also associated with schizophrenia. Very disorganized thinking. That's a principal symptom, positive symptom of schizophrenia. If you take enough of it, you can essentially be like that guy on the table there, where you just flop over. Your eyes might be wide open, and you're in what we call a K-hole. It's where you are completely unresponsive. Your mind might be somewhat working, but you can't control or move your body in any way. You might be experiencing many of these dissociative and hallucinogenic effects there, but you can't do a thing. And if, of course, you're a little paranoid at the time, which can happen sometimes, and you can't move your body, I think it can be a little terrifying, given that you have complete loss of control. If you're taking it at a very high dose, ketamine can make you forget the whole experience, or at least some of it. because it blocks the very receptor systems that are key for memory formation. Why? Why would that be the case? Well, it boils down to that NMDA receptor again. So these NMDA receptors are critical for what we call associative synaptic plasticity. That if you have two neurons and they happen to fire around the same time, more specifically, if the first neuron fires and then the second neuron fires shortly thereafter, then the connections between those two neurons tend to strengthen. All right, so NMDA is really critical for that, for wiring up neurons to each other. And we think that that wiring up is at the basis for most of most memory formation. All right, so ketamine blocks that receptor, and so it blocks it. And so as a result, it can reduce that type of plasticity while ketamine is actually in your brain. So ketamine will be in your brain. If you take ketamine, it tends to be metabolized in about an hour, and then it will be gone. Unlike some other drugs like LSD, which stay in your system for many, many hours. So ketamine will be broken down, metabolized in around an hour. All right, so during that hour, you're going to have a severe limitation in your ability to form new memories. And here's the interesting thing, because it's a weird situation where you have this initial blockade of memory formation systems, but then later, for reasons we don't entirely understand, and somehow it relates to maybe excess brain-derived neurotrophic factor that ketamine somehow triggers the production of. But in the long term, what happens is you get, and this is by long term I mean hours to a day later, you get a big increase in the number of these dendritic spines, which we think are synapses, essentially, growing on many cortical and subcortical neurons. And so this increase in spines is associated with neuroplasticity, with at least increasing the number of potential contacts for neurons to form with other neurons. And so that's an increase in plasticity. And so you have this short-term reduction in plasticity and this longer-term increase in plasticity. So it's this interesting double opposite direction. So the short term you go one way and the long term you go the other way. Let's see. And so this, yeah. And so what we know too is that this also happens with things like LSD. And I show in the lower, I'll bring up the little pointer thing, in the lower right corner here, you see something similar with DMT, which is the active ingredient in ayahuasca. So you get this increased spine growth, and that we believe might have something to do with the antidepressant effect of ketamine and of the psychedelics like DMT and LSD. Although ketamine's by far more research right now with regard to its potential as an antidepressant. So I don't want to make any big claims that LSD or DMT are reducing depression, but we definitely are getting more evidence in ketamine might be effective. All right, here ketamine is a nice opportunity to review some of the cellular mechanisms for neural communication, just like serotonin and MDMA was a nice review of synaptic release. But here let's just review why or how the NMDA receptor works. So it's voltage gated, which means that in order to get that receptor to open up, you need the membrane to be depolarized, which usually means that you have to have a lot of glutamate being released, a lot of it. The second is that you need to have, because that's to open up AMPA channels. We'll talk about AMPA channels in a second. Second, you need to have glutamate binding to the receptor, and probably glycine as well. We won't talk about glycine. But this summarized, you need both depolarization and glutamate that causes that NMDA receptor to open up and then let in the sodium and, most importantly, calcium into the cell. The calcium is then key for triggering synaptic plasticity. It rushes in and it will ultimately encourage or cause more AMPA channels, which are also glutamate sodium channels, to migrate or become active in the membrane, the postsynaptic membrane, that makes the neuron more sensitive or more responsive to new input. All right, So, hey, that's the general process. So that's why this receptor, this NMDA receptor, is very important for synaptic plasticity and memory. You can find these receptors all over the brain, but they're very prominent in our memory areas in the cortex and in the hippocampus. And if you block them, you really do screw up memory in animals and humans. So they can't remember where the cheese was, if you're a rat, or if you're a human and you like cheese. So you just can't remember where things are. Yeah, you can't form new memories. All right, if you take a lot. Specifically, the receptor for ketamine and PCP on the NMDA receptor is at a location that's very, very different from the location for glutamate. And so it's just that's why we call it non-competitive, because it's not competing for access to the receptor site for glutamate. So they're not punching each other out to try to get access to that receptor site on the NMDA channel. Instead, it acts on its own site to foul up, essentially, screw up that NMDA receptor. Okay. I gave you a little summary of that in the previous slide, but let me just give it, because this is really important if you ever want to understand how memory in general works in the brain. And so here's how NMDA specifically contributes to memory formation and how ketamine or PCP screws it up. All right. So first, in order to get these NMDA receptors activated, you need to first have a lot of input driving that postsynaptic cell. That might mean that many other neurons that are connecting to that cell are also sending signals to the cell to depolarize it even more, or that a ton of glutamate is being released from the presynaptic terminal. So the thing is that you just need to have a lot of sodium essentially rushing into the postsynaptic cell to depolarize it, to make it more positive. Once it reaches a threshold of positivity, the NMDA receptor opens up, because it requires both voltage and glutamate, and then it opens up, and that receptor is big enough or special enough at least to let in calcium. And that calcium, once it rushes into the cell, triggers this calmodulin kinase 2, or people typically say CAM kinase 2. And CAM kinase 2 is a second messenger, which means it can do a whole bunch of things. But one of the key things for plasticity is it triggers the insertion of new AMPA receptors in the postsynaptic terminal. And by having more receptors, that means that terminal is going to be more sensitive to glutamate, which means it will be stronger. It'll be more responsive to the next presynaptic release. And so it strengthens the memory effectively, if you can reduce memory to an individual synapse, which maybe you can't, but for all effects and purposes, it increases the memory essentially between the pre and postsynaptic terminal. It strengthens the connection between those two neurons. All right. So again, well, just to summarize then, ketamine, PCP block NMDA receptors, so that whole process is screwed up. All right, switching gears, using ketamine as a therapy. People don't use PCP as a therapy because it makes you kind of psychotic and crazy. So ketamine, on the other hand, isn't quite as nasty. And so it's been used and gotten a lot of press in the last 10 years, even a little less than that, for treating depression and maybe PTSD. So generally, as we've already learned, it's used a lot as a general anesthetic. It's generally a pretty safe drug. And infusions, that means you get it IV over an hour or two, or nasal sprays more recently, may reduce severe depression. And this is interesting in that you only get like a treatment for an hour, and we know that ketamine is metabolized in about an hour, yet the reduction in depression can last for 2 to 3 weeks, which is amazing. But then it often wears off, and you might need to go back into the clinic again and get a booster treatment of ketamine. What's interesting as an aside, I'll put here, for treatment-resistant depression, if you're suicidal and have very serious issues, people are still administered electroconvulsive shock therapy, which sounds pretty horrific, but it can be life-saving and game-changing for someone truly suffering from super severe and even suicidal levels of depression. Well, what's interesting about electroconvulsive therapy is that it operates on a similar timeline in that it may work. You may go in there for a very short treatment with ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, and then it works and you'll be great for 2 or 3 weeks. And then you might have to come back for a booster treatment as well. So there's some interesting parallels in the therapeutic effects of ECT, and electroconvulsive therapy, and ketamine. Ketamine is not nearly as, I think, memory affecting as ECT. Electroconvulsive therapy is associated with a lot of memory deficits. Ketamine isn't associated with as many long-term, short-term, yes, but not long-term memory deficits. All right, moving on. Chronic pain. Some types of chronic pain can be treated very effectively with very, very long, like days-long infusions of high-dose ketamine. So that's another treatment. And then more recently, my lab and the lab of Dr. Torsten Falk over right here in Arizona, we're studying how ketamine may be used to reduce these uncontrollable dyskinetic movements that occur in Parkinson's disease patients after they've been taking their medications for a couple of years. So we actually not to think, but there's some evidence that Torsten Falk has collected in mice, and now they have some clinical data, not double-blinded controlled yet. We haven't gotten the funding for those studies, all those studies yet, but there's some studies ongoing now to see if it's effective in humans. But there's some evidence we have that it might actually reduce some of these dyskinetic movements in Parkinson's disease. So we'll let you know as that story unfolds. All right, with that, we'll end with the coyote.